Hi, Matt Landsman with Landsman Law. I want to take some time to go over Florida's new immigration law, which was just passed by Governor Ron DeSantis after an agreement with the Florida Republican legislature. This law has been signed yesterday, February 13th, 2025, and it is effective immediately. And that means as of today, the 14th, it is in effect. This is a very important law, has a lot of big repercussions for Florida and possibly the United States. So let's get into it. I just want to describe two basic concepts. The first is what the law in the criminal context is purporting to do. And then I'll also talk about some criticisms of what essentially could be wrong with it or things to be concerned about for the future. So first things first, what is the purpose of the law? What is it for? This law is clearly designed to support the agenda of Donald Trump and the mass deportation goals of the administration. That's what the intent is. That's what it's for. How it goes about doing that is based on how the details will be implemented. But let me go through that. And it essentially has a series of parts in this law. And there's more than just this law that goes into immigration changes in Florida and how they're being implemented. But I'm just talking about this new criminal law that's gone into effect. The first thing that's important about this law is that it calls for the mandatory death penalty of an unauthorized alien or unauthorized or illegal entrant who has committed certain capital offenses. The point of this is, I guess, to just signal to everybody that they want the death penalty for these people. However, it was already incredibly rare for convictions like this. And if it's capital, that means it kind of was already calling for the death penalty. In this case, they're just trying to say it should be automatic if they're an unauthorized alien. And I don't think this is really probably going to affect too many people. It's kind of theoretical in some ways in terms of how many people it affects. So, but that's one thing that's in the bill. So if there's a headline about it, it's really essentially the goal is probably just for that headline. It probably has almost no practical effect. Number two, the more important aspects of it have to do with the crime of basically being an unauthorized entrant
up to a year and a week in prison, and then it goes to 2 years in prison, and then up to 5, and then 5. Each one of them has been designated as kind of like a mandatory minimum, so there'd be no way out of it. It's like you're getting at least 9 months to a year in prison for these offenses. At least that's the way it looks like initially. Another key aspect of it is that it's going to have an forced notification of federal authorities. See, because this is a Florida law, and it's basically designed to be implemented by Florida police and sheriff's deputies throughout the state. And something that doesn't always happen in Florida and a lot of places is somebody's arrested for various crimes or contacts with law enforcement, and for whatever reason, their presence or their contact with law enforcement does not notify federal authorities because of the different governmental entity. But here, it's mandating that law enforcement will notify the federal authorities about this unauthorized immigrant. So that's one thing that's very important in this law. Number two, or the second section, part of that is, other than the notification, is that they're pending a trial for offenses like this. There will be no bond, which means you will be held pre-trial. This may not be constitutional. There's some problems with it, whether or not this is violating the separation of powers, because it may violate the rules of criminal procedure. But as it's written, there is not going to be any bond. The person's arrested and they will stay in custody. They can't post bond no matter what, based on the wording of this law. Now, within those are the main principles of how this law is to take effect. There's a couple exceptions written in this law, which are important, having to do with the concerns about what this law, with problems with this in the future. But the exceptions that they've kind of written in this law is, one is there's supposed to be an exception if the person the police are having contact with, who may be unauthorized, shouldn't be arrested if they're reporting a crime or a victim of a crime. So in the law itself, it seems to be contemplating this idea that some people the police are going to come into contact with may be committing this crime of an unauthorized entrant into Florida, but they are going to be protected from arrest because they're a witness or reporting of a crime or a victim. And then the other thing that's written in this, which could cause some concern later on, which seems to be like a protection though, is that there's an affirmative defense, which means, let's say they've entirely have the probable cause or evidence of conviction, but then a person can still kind of disprove their guilt with some sort of special exception. In this case, it would be like they do have a lawful status that was kind of granted to them by an agent of the federal government, or they have this other kind of exception. But that's an affirmative defense, meaning that it would be your burden to put that forward and prove it after, either during or after an arrest, to kind of get yourself out of the charge. So that's basically the concepts of the law and its and how it would be used. Mandatory penalties, notification, no bond. Those are the kind of the three important things to know about the implementation of this law. And there's some and with the two exceptions. So now that that's being said, there's some clear concerns or possibly illegalities in this law that I also wanted to talk about, which are important. And basically there's three parts to them, of these concerns. The first one has to do with the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution. So basically you have a federal government and a state government, and according to the U.S. Constitution, the supremacy clause, matters of foreign policy, including immigration and control of the borders, is kind of entirely preempted by the federal government. It's entirely within their control to do that, to control this. And so if there's a conflict when it comes to a state law and the feds, the state has to basically accede to the federal government, and they can't really violate that. So is there a problem with the way Florida is implementing this? Is it going to be so broad that it can be challenged by violating the supremacy clause? It seems pretty broad, but that's the kind of thing that you can't find out right now. That would have to be challenged in court, and is there a violation of that? And that has to do with how the courts would rule on it in any particular court or in different circumstances. The second thing that is clearly of concern in this law is a chilling effect on witnesses or victims of crimes. And you know there's a concern about this in this law because there's the exception about protecting or not arresting witnesses or victims of a crime is in the body of the law. That's because somebody was concerned enough about it already that they wrote it in there. And now the issue, though, is what does the law actually have a chilling effect on victims and witnesses to crimes? And that has to do with reporting them to begin with, right? Are they going to possibly not report it or not communicate with some issue with law enforcement because they're worried about their own or somebody else's status or their contacts with law enforcement? And even if it is reported and not arrested that day, maybe they're concerned about being arrested or charged in the future, because it could protect you from arrest that day, but that doesn't necessarily mean it could protect you later on if you go to court or some part of the process in some other way. So there would be an initial concern about calling something in or witnessing something and talking about it and having any sort of communication with law enforcement. And there's also concern with cooperation with the criminal justice system, which requires usually multiple court dates, witnesses, lots of contact with law enforcement. This could all of a sudden have the exact opposite effect of what the people who signed it want, which would be getting purportedly dangerous people out of the country and making people safer. If people are actually less safe because now you're having less crime being reported and it actually causes people can act with impunity, it kind of contradicts the very purpose of the law, if that's the case. But you won't know that at first. It depends on how it's implemented and how people react to it. And then lastly, and probably the most important concern is there going to be some sort of discrimination involved in the implementation of this law. The clearest hint that there could be a problem with discrimination in the implementation of this law is the affirmative defense that's been written into it, saying, well, if you're an unauthorized entrant, there's an affirmative defense saying, well, maybe you can be protected from this law or be unarrested or not be convicted if you can prove you have lawful status or you've been authorized by the federal government or you have some other exception. But that doesn't mean you can't be arrested or charged with it if it's an affirmative defense. What does it mean to be allowed to be arrested or charged and then you have to disprove the offense? It means that the police are going to have substantial powers in their determination of probable cause, and who they arrest and how they go about their job is going to be subject to less scrutiny if you're the one who has to produce papers to show that you're not guilty. That sounds a lot like police asking people to show me your papers. That's what that sounds a lot like. If you're allowed to say, well, we don't think you're an authorized entry, we're going to investigate you or charge you, and then you have to prove that you're not unauthorized, that you are authorized. All those things are concerns. There could be even more coming up. This law just got implemented, and it's pretty unusual. Anyways, if you have any other questions, you can contact me, Matt Landsman, Landsman Law, for you.